Chapter 18. Back in the Real World. We drove cross-country for 2.5 days until we reached Wisconsin, where Becky's family lived. It was a wonderful, liberating time. I was exhilarated. Holy smokes, I'm free! Becky was equally flipped out. We could do whatever we wanted. We could stop anywhere we wanted to eat, and we could eat whatever we felt like having. All those chains that I had allowed Scientology to put on me and that I agreed were going to hold me down were Gone. It was a wonderful feeling. It was like being able to breathe again after being suffocated. It is hard to explain how it feels after more than 26 years of being nullified, told that you and your group are the worst group in the history of Scientology, and that L. Ron Hubbard had said so in memo after memo since Gold's formation, and that nothing you did could ever be right the first time. Yes, there were some good times mixed in. Don't think I'm saying that it was all negative, but the bad times far outweighed the good. While I lived at Gold, I had a case of eczema so bad that at times my sheets would be bloody from my violently scratching my legs. It would drive me nuts. I went to a doctor who asked me if I had been under any stress. No, I answered in all honesty. I was so used to the way things were that I sincerely did not believe I had stress in my life. 3 months after we left, the eczema went away and never returned. If you have built a prison for yourself, little by little, brick by brick, and you are living in it, you don't know that you're in prison. By agreeing to restrictions and insanities, you are putting up your own barriers. You are building the walls. You are putting the bars in the window. That is how it happened, and that is how I ended up staying there for nearly 27 years. It is probably how many groups in history have found themselves trapped. People can become trapped by their own thoughts. Let's face it, oppressors are always far fewer in number than the oppressed. Why don't the oppressed simply chop them up with hatchets or just stop listening to them? Because the oppressed have been told by the authorities that this is the way it has to be, so they believe it, and they begin slowly putting up these barriers in their own minds. Next thing they know, they are living in this shell of a prison. That is the way it happens. There's no other way it can be done. I'm sure of it. That was the prison I built for myself, and the authority at first was L. Ron Hubbard. Then David Miscavige, his unappointed successor, usurped the authority. David's approach of keeping people thinking they were incapable and that he had to do everything, his constant refrain, caused people to feel sorry for him since he had to do everything. And they listened to him because he was the authority figure. All these restrictions. You have to have your mail checked. You cannot go on liberty. You can't go to a store, and many more. Each is another little bar for your jail cell. You build your own prison, and you live in it. It is fair to ask, why don't people simply leave? Here are some of the reasons. Many people at Gold and other Sea Org installations have been in Scientology for 20, 30, 40 years or even longer, and they have zero savings. They live from week to week on their $50 allowance. They don't have a car. They have next to no social security. They have no particular skills that will get them a job in the outside world, and many have no place to go. Perhaps their parents have died, or they don't have sisters or brothers. If they left, they would literally be out on the street. You hear stories about someone who has been in prison for 15 or 20 years, and after a while, that's all he knows. He hangs out in the yard, he gets 3 meals a day, he has a place to sleep, he can watch TV. So eventually he is released, and what does he do? He commits another crime so he can go home again. For the people at the base, these considerations are huge barriers to obtaining their freedom. People become willing to tolerate anything. How do they do it? I'll tell you how. They go numb. Their attitude becomes, I don't care what happens to me. That's how you can tolerate it. I adopted that attitude myself at times. We would be at one of the Saturday night briefings, and Gold would be getting ripped apart with Religious Technology Center staffers standing along the walls and spotting people in the audience who looked sour. I would sit comfortably in my chair thinking, I don't care what happens. That is a terrible state of mind. Just terrible, believe me. Those are just some factors that I think explain how intelligent, well-meaning, good-hearted people become involved in Scientology and stay in it long after their good sense screams at them to get out. These, however, are negative aspects. I think Scientology also has positive facets that keep people coming back for more. Hubbard possessed an impressive vocabulary. He was a charismatic speaker, spicing his lectures with entertaining stories and humor, and he came across as an intelligent, well-meaning person. He could lecture for 90 minutes with no notes, simply speaking off the cuff. Whether he used his gifts to con people is not the issue here. Taken at face value, he was impressive. He came off as learned. These characteristics carry some authority with people, and his public persona was jovial and easy to like. Listen to one of his recorded lectures, and you can get a sense of what he was like at his best. Several lectures that he had filmed show him at his most engaging. More important, his lectures contained principles and concepts that people found useful in their lives, regardless of whether he developed them himself or repackaged what others before him had said. He presented a perspective from which people could understand the factors in their lives more clearly, and he gave them concrete ways to apply his ideas. After listening to a few more lectures or reading more of Hubbard's writings, a person would begin to develop some confidence in what he was saying. A and B worked, so the person begins to feel that C will also work. At some point along the line, the person continues to believe whatever he said. When faced with a new concept that they may not grasp immediately, this person thinks, well, he's been right before. I guess he's right here too. Later on, when this person's experience with more advanced teachings does not deliver the same insights as earlier, or when friction inevitably occurs because of the imperfect workings of the organization, the person resolves the cognitive dissonance that ensues by recalling the experiences that were positive and the principles that did work. I doubt a single person who has ever been involved with Scientology has not been rubbed the wrong way by the organization. I had my fair share in the nearly 27 years I was in it. Probably the most degrading thing that happened to me in my whole career in the Sea Org was being thrown overboard. This was a disgusting remnant of the days aboard the Apollo, when Hubbard, in fits of pique, ordered that offending trainees and others be tossed over the side of the ship into the water, while the ship's chaplain uttered some stupid incantation about committing one's sins to the deep, and hoping that the victim would become a better person. 2 crew members would grab the unlucky ones and literally toss them into the water 20 or more feet below. Thankfully, no one ever died as a result, but that is an example of the ruthlessness that Hubbard was capable of. That little practice was resurrected at Gold during David's tenure. For some offense, the reason escapes me now, I was ordered to be overboarded once. At Gold, this was done by marching the person out to the small lake that once was part of the golf course. A stone bridge had been built out to an island in the lake. I stood on the bridge, was allowed to take off only my shoes and wristwatch. The port captain recited the same stupid litany, and I was pushed off the bridge fully clothed into the murky water below. It was a ridiculous but degrading moment, and accomplished nothing of any value, except to alienate me even further. One of the others condemned to the same humiliation was an extremely overweight fellow. I thought to myself, this guy could actually drown. They pushed him off, and down he went. He disappeared below the surface and bobbed up, gasping. I was actually relieved to know he would be all right physically, if not psychically. Being overboarded was extreme, I'll admit. Most of the daily irritations were more minor, but happened every day. I used to eat raw garlic or raw onions because they are good for my health. One day I went into the galley and asked a cook for an onion. She gave me one, and off I went. At dinner that evening, I was sitting at my table when another cook came out and began lambasting me in front of everybody because I had taken the galley's last onion. I hadn't taken the last diamond from the crown jewels or the Mona Lisa from the Louvre. Another cook had simply given me the last onion from the galley stores. This apparently reflected the stress this cook was under because of having a food budget of only $3 per person per day, or $1 per meal. Being out of onions apparently stressed this cook to the point that someone needed to hear about it, and that person was me. Such tension permeated every part of the organization. It was an ever-present part of life at Gold, and a super-effective way to build calluses on your social interactions. People were under extreme pressure to perform on their jobs, and the lack of adequate resources was never an acceptable excuse. Who knows, maybe onion soup was on the menu for the next day, but with the last onion now gone, the cook's menu planning was ruined. Throughout our cross-country trip, Becky and I talked and talked and talked. We vented all the things we dared not voice while at the base, or that we were too tired to say once we got home at night. Those few days were therapeutic. When we stopped for gas, we paid cash. When we stopped for food, we paid cash. When we booked a motel at night, we paid cash. The church is good at tracing credit card payments and therefore your route, so everything was strictly cash. When we got to Iowa, Becky called her brother. He was visiting friends when she called, and she could overhear him saying to someone in the background, "Somebody get me a drink! I'm celebrating! Becky's coming home!" We went to Becky's mother's place in Whitewater, Wisconsin. I figured that was the only safe place we could go. Both of my daughters, Denise and Lori, are Scientologists, and if we had gone to them, the Scientology goons could have found us, and neither of my daughters would have prevented David's stooges from talking to us. Becky's mother is not a Scientologist, so they wouldn't dare barge into her place. We settled in with her mother, who was happy to have us. We spent a while just enjoying our freedom. I must have gained 15 pounds. I could eat cherry pie anytime I wanted to. Back on the base, there was a kitchen in the music studio, but if you went in there at any time other than scheduled meal times, you would be in trouble if anyone saw you, even for a drink of water. "What are you doing in here, Ron?" the music manager would say. I guess he thought that David Miscavige was the model executive, so he mimicked David's behavior. 2 weeks after we arrived, I was standing in the kitchen and saw our old friend Marion Powell walk past the window snooping. I went outside, and standing there were Marion and Greg Wilhere. As I have mentioned, these are two of David's top henchmen, and they had finally tracked us down. "Hey," they said cheerily, "I bet you're wondering why we didn't come here sooner." To them, nothing had changed. They acted as if it was just like old times. "Wow, we thought you were going to go to Lori's place. You sure surprised us." They were laying it on real thick, pretending cheerfulness. "We thought you were going to go to Florida. That's why we weren't here sooner." I was guarded, but somewhat friendly. The conversation quickly turned to our returning to the base. "I'm not going back." "Come on, Greg," I said. "I escaped." "You didn't escape. You blew," he shot back, and he pulled out a Hubbard policy directive called Leaving and Leaves, which describes the protocol to be followed when someone leaves staff. Of course, that policy is never applied when someone asks to leave. It is dragged out only when people from the base are trying to convince someone who has escaped, or blown, as they say, to return. Go to hell, man. I'm not reading that. I'm not going to keep living under that goddamn suppression. I was no longer surrounded by 400 people who were going to jump me if I talked that way. It was only 2 against 1, and I would take those odds any day. "Listen, guys, it's not okay that you came here, and I'm not going back." "Okay, let's talk," they countered. I agreed. The next day, I met them in town in a parking lot. David wants to talk to you. Give me your cell phone number. Greg opened. Screw you, Greg. I'm not giving you my number. I'm through. You no longer have me. By this time, I was totally willing to use force on him. Okay, he said. I have a message from Dave for you. Please, please come back. You don't have any idea what you're doing to me. Please come back. Greg was playing the part of a whiny chihuahua to the hilt. One of them also told me that the security guard had to tell David that we had escaped, and the guard literally had to struggle to get the words out of his mouth. David's response to bad news is simply to shoot the messenger. The guard finally told him we had left, and David's response was, "In my wildest dreams, this is something I never thought I would see." Well, in my wildest dreams, I never thought I could end up living that way, as a prisoner, a virtual prisoner. Greg saw that I still needed convincing. Look, he argued, if you come back, you can go to Flag. You can have your own apartment. There's cooking facilities. You can work whatever hours you want. And maybe, if you want, you can teach these young kids to sell, and you can play with the musicians if you want. And then, if you don't like that, you can do what you just did and leave again. Greg, I am not going back. I don't doubt for a second that the message he delivered came from Dave because of the words, "You don't have any idea what you're doing to me." What I was doing to him? Only one person in the world would have the balls to say that. My son, David. Let us take you out to dinner. There's a real nice place we've found. And after, we can go to a movie. These schmucks actually had the nerve to think they were going to schmooze me into going back with dinner and a movie. They must have thought we were dating. What the hell was this? These people were from outer space. They think that they can come to somebody who had to escape to get away from that life, and that the person is now going to say, "Gee, guys, I'm sorry, of course I'll come back." How much more wrong could they have been about a person like me? They seriously miscalculated if they thought they could flatter me into going back, or that I would act contrite and say, "Oh, shucks, I'm sorry, guys. All right, we'll come back. We'll face the music." That was the end of it. They were staying in a motel on the other side of town and getting around in a rented Jeep. They called every day. I never answered their calls. They must have called for a month. Meanwhile, Denise and Lori and I had been talking frequently. It was like old times with them. They were glad to be back in touch, and so was I. Denise even offered us the use of her husband's boat, a yacht that was moored at a marina in Clearwater. She said we'd be safe there. Denise had also been talking to Ronnie and had given him my phone number. I had no idea where Ronnie was living and no way of contacting him because he had left Scientology years before, in 2000. One day he called me out of the blue. It was a pleasant surprise. "Ronnie, how are you doing? How did you get my number?" "You buy vitamins from VitaCost, right? Well, they sent me one of your invoices thinking I was you and it had your number on it." I did not know at the time that Denise had given him my number. Both of us are named Ronald Miscavige. Ronnie buys supplements from VitaCost as well. Of course, it is completely illogical that they would send the invoice of someone living in California, where I had been ordering before we escaped, to someone living in Virginia, even with the same name. But I was so happy to speak to Ronnie that the point slipped past me. The VitaCost tale was what we called a shore story in the Sea Org. In other words, a lie. When I was talking to Denise later, I said, "Guess what? Ronnie called me." "Oh, really?" she said, pretending she didn't know anything about it. "Wow, that's great, Dad. Now, Ronnie's is a place where you should go. I'm sure he'll take care of you. He built a house. It has a guest room in case you ever came by." She talked me into going to Ronnie's house in Virginia. The next time Ronnie called, he invited us to come down for a visit. A little while later, Becky and I flew down, and we stayed with Ronnie and his wife, Biddy, for a week and had a great time. When we got back to Whitewater, I called the motel where Greg and Marion were staying. I asked to speak with Greg Wilhere and was told that they had checked out the day after Becky and I flew down to Virginia. The church has ways of tracking people when they fly, and that is how they knew we had gone to Virginia. They had stayed in Wisconsin for a month after I had told them we would never go back, and even though I never took a single one of their calls. Why did they stay? Simple. They did not want to return until COB. We couldn't get them back. You can be sure they were both in a world of hurt after they limped back onto the base. That August, Becky and I drove down to Virginia, stopping in Indiana to visit Becky's dad and my old hometown of Mount Carmel on the way. We stayed with Ronnie for nearly a year. Becky got a job and I sold exergenies and began looking around for gigs as a musician. I also started reading the internet and began finding out stuff about L. Ron Hubbard that I had never known, such as his war record, his previous marriages, and so on. I got in touch with other people I knew from the base who also had left. One was Hubbard's granddaughter, Roanne Horwich, who left after I did. When we spoke, she said she had been planning to blow that same Sunday as well, but couldn't because we got out first. She felt she had to make sure there was not some general concern with people escaping, so she waited a month before driving out the gate. I began contacting other people from the base who had left. Mark Headley, Steve Hall, Joe Kineen, and a really good friend Fernando Gamboa, the longtime drummer for the Gold Musicians. As I talked to them and read more on the internet, I began to see how I had been duped. L. Ron Hubbard was not the heavenly soul the church made him out to be, not even close. Despite his many obvious warts, however, he did codify a lot of things that he learned from other people and advanced their theories with discoveries of his own. That may be hard to fathom for anyone who has read news stories about Scientology and Hubbard. I don't doubt that Hubbard read and learned from Aleister Crowley, the British occultist and writer, or that he and Jack Parsons were dabbling in black magic and planning to create a moonchild, a perfect soul, captured through black magic rituals. I don't doubt that Hubbard was a con man, but I believe that each of us is capable of engaging in negative or positive behavior. Whichever you choose is your decision as an individual. Your experiential track will lead you to adopt certain moral codes or develop a conscience, or whatever you want to call it, and that will deter you from acting out certain behaviors. A person can choose to live a fruitful, productive life, helping people, and I firmly believe that you get the most benefit out of life that way. If you begin doing evil stuff, it is going to come back to you somehow. If there is one point where I think Scientology falls down, it is this. Hubbard stated time and time again that Scientology was a scientific approach to the mind and life. He wrote that Scientology was the meeting ground between science and religion. The very large problem with that is that science progresses in a precise way. Someone advances a theory and tests it out. Other scientists replicate the experiments that validate or invalidate the original theory. Others weigh in on the subject. Other ideas are tossed around, some good, some not so good. Advances come from that process. That's science. When someone asserts, "This is the way it is," period, that is not science. That is authoritarianism, and it quickly becomes a cult, which is what Scientology is today. Ever since Hubbard's death in 1986, Scientology has stopped progressing, and even fossilized. That isn't science, if indeed it ever was. At any rate, down in Virginia, Becky and I got along great with Ronnie and Biddy, and life was good. But Ronnie's daughter, Jenna, and grandkids were out in San Diego. Biddy had been spending a lot of time there, and I wondered, what if he decides to move out there with them? He was going out to visit all the time, so I finally told Ronnie that we were going to move back to Wisconsin. We had been in Virginia for nearly a year, but it was time to settle down near Becky's mother and her relatives, a situation that would be more supportive than our going it alone in Virginia. I like the weather in Wisconsin better. I like the seasons and the cold up there. Having grown up in Pennsylvania, I came to enjoy it. Becky got a job with the same chain as an assistant store manager in Wisconsin. In June 2013, we moved back in with her mother and began looking for a house. And that deserves a chapter of its own.